Control is a game I wanted to talk about because it's probably going to be skipped by most people and lost to the dark corners of time by next month. And I think it's easy to see why. It's not a big sequel, it's not a console exclusive, it doesn't have a huge marketing push behind it, and most importantly, it came out right before Gears 5 and Borderlands. Despite all that, this is a game that I've been keeping tabs on since its E3 reveal last year, and that's because of its developer, Remedy. With their past two Microsoft-affiliated games, Quantum Break and Alan Wake, Remedy have cemented themselves, at least in my mind, as one of the few developers in the AAA space that are intent on reinventing themselves and doing something different with each game, which usually results in them taking huge risks and just doing generally weird things. My hunch from the get-go was that Control would have more emphasis on gameplay than Remedy's last two games, and that ended up being the case. The format here, while a linear progression, is more reminiscent of this year's Resident Evil 2 remake than it is of something like Alan Wake. Instead of disconnected levels, we get one huge building that contains the entire play space within it. It's not quite open world, but there is a considerable amount of backtracking, as well as side missions and entire areas that aren't required to complete the game. For example, there's keycards that progress the main story, but can also be used to unlock hidden areas from much earlier, and there's a few places that can't be reached without late game abilities. Exploring this world is very much an activity and a part of the gameplay. Then there's the combat, which is the other main component of Control's gameplay. It starts off extremely, almost pathetically simple, and then builds upon itself very nicely, which is something that Remedy has been great at doing in their past games too. In Control, you have only one gun, the service weapon, but it can transform into 5 distinct forms. My favorites ended up being the shotgun and sniper, but there's also a standard pistol, a Gatling gun, and a grenade launcher. Shooting is solid, but on its own, it would get old really quick, which is probably why the combat loop includes a flurry of different abilities. As you progress through the game, you'll get powers like telekinesis, levitation, mind control, ground slams, teleport dodging, and a shield. Surprisingly enough, I didn't find myself relying on just one ability. I was genuinely chaining all of them together, with the notable exception of the shield, which felt kind of useless. These abilities are where Control's combat gets its flavor from. It feels like a more fleshed out version of Quantum Break's combat system, with more freedom in terms of how you can approach fights. The core gameplay formula here works. You explore new areas and engage in combat, which becomes progressively more complex as you level up your favorite weapon forms and abilities. However, I should mention that outside of 2 or 3 specific fights that were abnormally brutal, this is a very easy game, and I found myself plowing through it. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, I didn't go into this expecting a challenge, but I have to admit that the combat started to wear a bit thin in the homestretch of the game. It's not that there's anything wrong with the gameplay, but the enemy variants are basic, and save for a small handful of very light puzzles, there is nothing here that breaks up the gameplay. It's 90% fighting and exploring. I think the inclusion of deeper and more frequent puzzles, as well as more of an emphasis on platforming, would have done a lot for the gameplay and helped to keep things feeling fresh.
The Ocean View Motel and Casino. Green logic. The light switch cord. The door marked with the black pyramid.
Whoa. Have we been here before?
Even though the gameplay was clearly more of a focus here, Control is still a Remedy game, so the story is a central component. In Control, you play as Jessie Faden, who has a mysterious entity in her head that guides her to the Federal Bureau of Control, a fictional department of the US government that covers up paranormal events all over the country. Jessie herself was involved in one such paranormal event, which resulted in the Bureau taking her brother. Shortly after arriving at the Bureau, she finds the director shot dead in his own office in an apparent suicide. She then picks up the service weapon, which accepts her as its new owner, thus making Jessie the new director of the Bureau. At this point, it is revealed that the entire bureau has been compromised by a paranormal force known as the Hiss, which has possessed the majority of the bureau's employees, resulting in a lockdown of the entire building. As the new director, it's Jesse's duty to eliminate the Hiss and remove the lockdown. All of this is quickly established within the first 30 minutes of the game, which is kind of a clusterfuck if I'm honest. It's full of non sequiturs and information that I wasn't sure what to do with, which was super off-putting and made me unsure of what I was getting into, both story and gameplay-wise. In reality though, the story is actually rather simplistic. Jessie is looking for her brother and hoping to find out more about the entity in her head and the incident in her hometown along the way. Jessie is a serviceable protagonist, and her motivations are enough to push the game forward, but after an hour or two of playing, it became clear to me that the main character here is not Jessie, but instead the world and lore that Remedy have crafted to surround her. As you work your way deeper and deeper into the Bureau, you'll be exposed to all manner of bizarre concepts and phenomena that its inhabitants treat like settled science. Everything in this game operates on the same logic as a lucid recurring dream or nightmare. All of it is total nonsense, but in the moment, it somehow makes complete sense. The paranormal events the Bureau covers up are considered to be altered world events, and they come from and create altered items and objects of power. Physical objects that appear to be normal, everyday items, but in reality have a strong connection to the astral plane. The objects of power can be wielded by some gifted individuals, and that's how you get your powers in the game. For example, an old TV gives you levitation. It's really hard to make this stuff sound compelling once you rip it out of the context of the game, but all of it is surprisingly well thought out and executed with such confidence that it's hard to not get immersed in it. While I would describe the tone as being dreamlike or even nightmarish, I didn't find it to be scary like a horror game, though it might be for some people. What I did find it to be was odd, disorienting, just straight up weird as hell, which is a huge positive for me. This game, its aesthetic, its world, its lore, it all has character, which is so hard to find in more mainstream games these days, and it's easily the thing I appreciated most. So yes, the main story is kind of light and doesn't really have a big payoff, but I'm willing to mostly ignore it since you spend far more of your time learning how things work in this world, through visual storytelling, in-universe videos, and supplementary text and audio materials. Finding an employee that's been staring at a refrigerator for hours because if he stops, it's going to kill him sounds absurd, but Remedy has managed to make an entire game full of things like that something that I'm genuinely interested in, which is an accomplishment for sure. I can imagine that for some, it's just going to be drivel or weird for the sake of being weird, but for me, it really worked in achieving a pretty unique setting and world. This weird world is supported with visuals that, while technically impressive, shine more from an artistic standpoint if you ask me. Since the entirety of the game takes place within one large building, there naturally isn't a lot of location variety here, but there is a high level of polish and a unique sense of style. The architecture is a mix of brutalism, mid-century modern, and maybe a little Art Deco, and the technology used by the Bureau is time ambiguous, part retro, part modern. They've managed to create a distinct and coherent visual style here. I was hard-pressed to find anything ugly or out of place. Now, I don't want to shortchange the Northlight engine, which is carried over here from Quantum Break, since it enables a lot of cool effects from shape-shifting rooms to physics that add visual weight to the combat abilities. Flip side of that is that I'm hearing performance on the consoles, especially base models, is abysmal, and even on my beefy PC, I had to dial back settings quite a bit to get good frame rates. After doing that, I was perfectly fine, and the game on a technical level feels extremely solid. Outside of mandatory motion blur, there's no weird lag or hitching with the engine, it's just taxing to run with some of the higher settings. So if you're considering playing this game, you should probably look into some benchmarks if you're on PC, or for console players, check in on the recent patch.
Something's coming. The whispers growing louder. The worst winter storm in Bureau history. Retribution for my sins. Our sins.
Overall, Control is a 7.5 out of 10 for me. Good, almost great. As I mentioned, the big issue for me is gameplay variety. It took around 9 to 10 hours to beat it while doing a decent chunk of side activities, and the whole time it felt like it needed just a little bit more to push it over the edge into great. Considering the format and the increased focus on gameplay compared to previous Remedy games, I'm kind of shocked by the lack of more puzzles and platforming. When you look at the world design with its shape-shifting rooms, it seems like that stuff would be right at home here, and the game would have majorly benefited from it. Much like Quantum Break, I had a great time playing it, but I don't think it's the sort of game you should drop everything to play, and I doubt that it'll have a lasting impact. This is a game you should consider picking up when it drops to around $40 and you have a day off or some vacation time in the future and there's a lull in big game releases. That being said, the style and weirdness of the world and its visual design are huge standouts for me, and I applaud Remedy for their continued willingness to take risks with games like this in an increasingly unforgiving game market that doesn't seem to reward that kind of behavior very often. If you're interested in seeing more gaming, peripheral, and tech videos, consider subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to stay up to date with my future video plans, the best way to do that would be to check out my Discord and Twitter, links to both in the description. Until next time, thanks for watching.